because I have the impression that in a lot of situations, what you're often dealing with are not necessarily children who are undocumented and worried about what's the removal procedure going to be for them, but you have U.S. citizen children who have undocumented parents, or parents who are green card holders but might be deportable. And so the children may end up in juvenile court because the parents have been detained, and it's a big sort of difficult to understand or even get information about, like, what in the world is going on with these parents, what are the timelines for things happening, and how might that impact the juvenile case. So I'll try to give you an overview of the apprehension and removal in a very brief way. And then I'll also make sure to cover Nebraska-specific immigration resources for you. There's a section of the presentation that's about recent and pending immigration legislation that's, I think, useful to know about, but it is very clearly spelled out in the PowerPoint, so if I don't have time, I may skip that part, but it may be useful for you to see, because often you'll have clients or children who may not qualify for any of these immigration benefits, and they're doing great, and they're doing great in school, and there's nothing they qualify for, and so there is pending immigration legislation to address their particular situation as kids. So even if I don't get through all of it, at least you may take a look at it. But basically here we have situations of DHS and how do people get onto the immigration radar. And it is in a variety of ways. Sometimes people are apprehended at the border, either when they're attempting to enter and they're not admissible, or they're sneaking over the border and they get caught. They also might get picked up either in targeted arrests where the Immigration Service is ostensibly looking for one individual, or they might get picked up in larger sweeps and typically in workplace raids. They also may be turned over by local law enforcement. If you have a situation where someone is in the custody of a state, say they're in juvenile hall or they're in an adult criminal facility, typically the way that the Immigration Service would deal with that situation, if they decide they are interested in looking into this person's possible deportability, is that they'll put something called a detainer on a person. And I've actually included at page 104 a copy of a detainer. If you're representing a child who people think might have an immigration hold, it's really important that you get a copy of this document. It is basically a formal instruction from the Immigration Service, it's page 104, that requires that the Immigration Service be notified if the person's getting transferred to another institution, and also be notified when the person is going to be released from custody. Because what the Immigration Service may do with the detainer is to come, and when the person would otherwise be released, the Immigration Service may come and pick them up. The thing that's really important to know, particularly for those of you who represent juveniles in delinquency who may have holds, for those of you, definitely adults, representing adults in adult criminal cases, and for judges to understand, is that the detainer is not some open-ended, indefinite, we may someday want to pick up this person. The detainer is an instruction that is good for 48 hours from the time the person would otherwise be released from custody. Now this excludes holidays, it excludes weekends, but what it means is that it is not an instruction that a child should be sitting in juvenile hall for 3 weeks after they'd otherwise be released until someone at DHS decides they're going to come by and pick them up. Typically we've found, and I'm sure it varies place to place, that if the child is a high priority for removal, DHS will probably come and get them quickly. If they're a low priority or the Immigration Service has decided they don't want to pick up the child, they're not going to come quickly for the child, typically. And so it's really important for everyone to understand that this is not an open-ended invitation for the Immigration Service to get the child. It's an instruction to a state agency to hold the child for 48 hours. And this is true for adults and it's true for children. And so after those 48 hours, the person should be released. And that's why if you have a child and there's a hold on them, the plan can't simply be immigration is going to take the child, because we, you, me, or anyone else cannot force the Immigration Service to take the child. They may come or they may not, and then there needs to be a plan in place for what's going to happen with the child after those 48 hours, because it may be that there will be no pickup. Children and adults have certain rights in the face of immigration enforcement, and there are materials that are online that are sort of know your rights information for immigrants that may be helpful, but it is important for them to know that they do have the right to remain silent in the face of immigration questioning, and that evidence or statements that are made to the Immigration Service may be used in proceedings against them. Now I have current cases pending where I'm challenging the admissibility of statements made by children to the Immigration Service, but it's certainly not clear-cut that those are excludable in immigration proceedings. You may have clients who understand this and choose to talk, but at least having that information is useful for them to know. If the child is actually picked up by the Immigration Service, then a few things may happen. I'll tell you what happens to kids and then to adults. If the child is deemed to be accompanied, then typically they'll be released to a parent or guardian. They may be kept in detention by ICE if they have sort of serious delinquency issues, but generally they're going to be released. If they're deemed unaccompanied by the Immigration Service, they're going to be turned over to the Federal Office of Refugee Resettlement, and ORR is going to be responsible for their care, for putting them in a shelter, and for trying to locate a family member or a sponsor to release the child to. So in most situations, even if a child is picked up on a hold, they're not kept by the Immigration Service, and they're not put on a van and driven across the border, but the Office of Refugee Resettlement is given the obligation to search for a way to release the children from custody. And certainly there are kids who are not released, but there are no, like I mentioned, ORR facilities, secure facilities in Nebraska. So if you have a child who's picked up on a hold and that child, it can't be released to anyone, that child will be who knows where. The child could be in my neighborhood, the child could be in Florida. The child will be sent where there's empty space for that child, but there's really not a whole lot of rhyme or reason about where they'll go. And they certainly may not be placed locally. Go ahead.
If they do decide to continue detention on the child, do they have the ability then to, there are 3 holds currently that I have in Douglas County,
right,
but they are being kept at the youth center and the county correction.
Right. And have they been processed or like picked up by the Immigration Service? Allegedly? Right. Sometimes what happens is that there are ways that the government, the federal government, the question is what sort of happens. You may have kids who are in juvenile halls or placements who have holds placed on them. Sometimes they may be picked up. Sometimes the Immigration Service contracts with local delinquency facilities if they want to keep kids who have serious delinquency dispositions. So there may be times when they do act on a hold, but the physical placement of the child may not change dramatically. If they're keeping the child in a secure facility, they may actually have the child remain in a delinquency facility. But there are rules and pretty, clear rules, and I'm happy to give people more information if it comes up. But the government does have an obligation to seek the least restrictive placement for a child, and there are certain situations where a child may pose danger, where they'll be kept in more secure facilities. But it is useful to look into that because you may have a child who's in a juvenile delinquency facility that maybe has the right to be placed in something less restrictive. Anyway, if you have the accompanied, the unaccompanied, there may be times if they're released from Office of Refugee Resettlement care, they may be released to parents, to guardians. Sometimes they're also released to local child welfare agencies. So there have been cases where children are wards of the court. They get on the bus. Unfortunately, there's ICE and checks the bus, and ICE picks up the child. The child's a ward, and there have been instances where the Immigration Service will release to a child welfare agency. So from the Immigration Service's perspective, I think, they are not terribly interested in keeping large numbers of children in custody. Now, they do have large numbers of children in custody, but they also have serious liability issues and cost issues that go along with that. So there is an active process for getting released for kids. Either way, whether they're released or not released, typically the child is going to be placed in removal proceedings. Now, there are some cases where the Immigration Service exercises discretion not to place kids in removal. And the thing that you should know is that the Immigration Service is not required to place anyone in removal proceedings. There are discretionary decisions that are made and prosecutorial decisions that are made about who does the Immigration Service actively want to deport. And there are certainly cases, and I have one right now, of a child who was only 5 years old when she was apprehended. She was released to a sponsor, and the Immigration Service never filed this notice to appear in immigration court. And we're going to do requests and make sure that it never really was filed, but it seems pretty clear to me that it was an exercise of discretion on part of the Immigration Service not to try to place the child in removal proceedings. Both her parents were deceased, and she was released to a relative here. But typically, if you have adults or children who are apprehended, they may be placed into removal proceedings. But going back for 1 minute to the adult side, if you have an adult who's taken into detention, the adult detention system is just a world apart from children's federal facilities. And many adults are held without bond. There are a lot of mandatory grounds for detention. Even if the person is bondable out of immigration custody, family may not be able to raise the money to get the bond. And so you have a lot more adults who are in federal custody, but often that custody is actually in local facilities that contract with the Department of Homeland Security. So there are actually facilities all over Nebraska that are holding immigrant detainees. They're not holding them any longer because they're serving their criminal sentences. They're holding them because that's where the federal government has decided they're going to house people while they put them through removal proceedings. Again, with very few exceptions, usually involving people who have prior removal orders, the government can't just put people in a van and send them across the border, but they do have due process protections in removal proceedings. They have the right to go in front of an immigration judge for the judge to decide whether they're removable and also whether they qualify for any kind of immigration relief. They have the right to counsel, but they have no right to government-appointed counsel, and that goes across the board for children and adults. So it would really help to have an immigration attorney and for kids in proceedings, and if you have a client who's in proceedings, I would urge you to try to find an attorney to represent them, and there's a list of agencies that may be able to help you, but even if you call me, I'll try to help find someone, because the reality is that it is very difficult, even for a child who qualifies for immigration relief, it's incredibly difficult for them to do this on their own. You have an immigration judge, you have an incredibly experienced prosecutor for the government, and then you have an unrepresented child. The child will appear before the immigration judge, determine removability, and it's something that people may think but isn't the case, is that the simple fact the child's a ward of the state doesn't prevent the government from deporting them. It doesn't prevent the government from issuing a removal order. It doesn't prevent the government from actually physically deporting the child. So if you have a client or a child who's in removal proceedings, it's not something that we just sort of don't deal with, or you can choose to do that, but the reality is the proceedings will move forward with or without any assistance. And again, this is true for adults. Same issue about right to counsel, same right to go before the immigration judge. If you have a child or adult who fails to appear for their immigration hearing, they will be issued an in absentia removal order. So if you're supposed to drive the client to court and you are really late or you decide not to go, that child will probably end up with a removal order. Now, most detained adults don't have this problem because they're detained. But it is a big issue that comes up, and a lot of times we run into kids who have prior removal orders and they actually had no idea that one was ever issued against them. They were really young and they didn't even know they were in removal proceedings. If you have a child who actually gets ordered removed and they're not in federal custody, they'll get a bag and baggage letter to tell them to show up at a certain date and time with a certain limited amount of luggage to be removed from the U.S. If they're in custody, then the government will make additional arrangements for their removal. If they get an adverse decision from the immigration judge, they can appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals and also to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals in their area. But again, there's no right to government-appointed counsel. So unless you can find an immigration attorney willing to do it pro bono or an organization, you're going to have the child is going to have an incredibly hard time negotiating any of this. So these are just a couple ways that even though you yourself may not be able to take on one of these cases if you don't have the expertise or feel you don't, there are still ways that people in juvenile court may be helpful in these cases. Some of it just is sort of trying to link up the family, whether it's an adult or child, with an immigration attorney. It also may be that the child may still qualify for SIJS or the family qualifies for a U visa, and getting a certification or SIJS findings may be a huge help. And then again, the child may be applying for an immigration benefit and they need to show that they don't have adult criminal convictions. You may be able to help to get juvenile court documents to establish that these were juvenile proceedings. And then again, any subsequent delinquency petitions, if they can be resolved in the least harmful way, that is useful. These are the slides that have information about the DREAM Act. So this is the Federal DREAM Act. I'm going to skip over these, but there are a couple of documents in the materials. One is a one-page flyer in the DREAM Act, and then I have also 2 pages in there that talk about the Nebraska DREAM Act, which I think some of you may know about, but it's an option for undocumented kids to get, excuse me, in-state tuition at Nebraska colleges. So it's worth looking at that if you're working with kids who are sort of in a transitional age, getting out of the system, that their hope of going to college, but they can't afford it, may be mitigated in some ways by taking advantage of the Nebraska in-state tuition. It does have a number of requirements that you should take a look at. And then this Federal DREAM Act is basically legislation that was proposed to help kids who are a long time been in the United States, are are behaving well, are trying to complete their education and want to go on to military service or community college or college, it would create a path to temporary sort of legal status and eventually to the ability to apply for permanent residency. And it's a bipartisan effort. It's been introduced many, many times going back to 2001. And there's no guarantee it will ever pass, but certainly for kids who don't qualify for anything else but are really trying to do well, the mere fact that this is pending sometimes gives them a bit of hope that in the future there may be something that's available to them. And it gets pretty wide support. It's hard to say how close it'll get this time, but it was just reintroduced this March. So it's definitely, I'm giving you a website where you can get more information about it. And then this is just the Trafficking Act that passed in late 2008. And I've talked sort of about the specifics for different immigration benefits. You can take a look at the PowerPoint, but there are other sort of things that are important about for kids and immigration, and you can take a look at those. Still no right to government-appointed counsel, but an idea that they should have counsel. And then for on the sort of federal funding side, there are some changes that allow local child welfare agencies or state agencies to more easily draw down federal money for the care of children, particularly who may have refugee status or who receive special immigrant juvenile status. So for any of you HHS employees out there who deal with funding issues, this is certainly something that's good to be on your radar. All right, this is another one. If you would like to have training from the Department of State or Homeland Security on any of these issues, they shall provide it to you upon request. Okay, the resources part of the presentation, I just want to highlight some things for you, but I can't say that this is fully comprehensive, but I've tried to include national and local resources for you on immigration issues for kids. So I put here some resources that I think you might find helpful. There's an organization called the Immigrant Legal Resource Center that has a focus, one of their foci are working on immigration issues for kids. So they've created a materials for special immigrant juvenile status. Because of the recent law changes, they're not yet updated, but they still are useful to look at. I have my own manual I've written. If you want to see a copy of it, you can email me and I can send it to you. They do have a bench book for juvenile court judges. And so if you're a juvenile court judge or you want to learn about what juvenile court judges might want to know about immigration, you can download. These are all free publications that are available to download from the website. There's an organization called the National Center for Refugee and Immigrant Refugee Children. They have a lot of resources. And then I've given some listings of additional special immigrant juvenile status resources. The bottom two here are really designed for providing assistance and advice to local and state child welfare agencies who work with refugee and immigrant kids. So these agencies are willing to take calls from any HHS employees who have questions, supervisors. They provide a lot of technical assistance. They don't give you the legal analysis of a child's immigration case, but a lot of issues that come up that are related to sort of language appropriate services, accommodations that can be made for dealing with people's immigration status, problems you may have with getting family members approved as caregivers for children if they're undocumented. The BRICS organization is really amazing. They have free technical assistance available. I emailed them and I confirmed that it's free. You can talk to them. These are some publications you might want to take a look at. One of them, the first one there is really helpful. It's just generally on working with immigrant and refugee children. It doesn't really talk about how to apply for immigration benefits, but it's more about the particular issues they might present in juvenile courts and sort of some advice and information about the ways you may have to do interviewing differently or issues that may come up for kids that may not for U.S. citizens. Now these are your local resources, and again, it's not comprehensive. I tried to list people who I've spoken with and who are willing to be on the slides. Everyone that I did speak to was very happy that juvenile courts were getting trainings on immigration issues and seemed really interested in working with folks from the juvenile court for children on the parent side. So I've listed here some people that I've spoken to have expertise in special immigrant juvenile status. They may not be able to take the case, but they certainly are willing to be a resource for you, as I am. I can sort of tell you what I would do, but I'm in LA. These people are working with the Omaha CIS office. They're working with the Nebraska juvenile courts. And so they may be able to really help you and give you guidance on how does this play out in Nebraska, how do the proceedings work here. And they've all said it was okay for me to put their phone numbers, so there they are. And then what I've then done is sort of listed other organizations that are generally nonprofits that don't charge for their services. And I've tried to list what kind of immigration benefits they work with. And luckily, there are quite a few that do VAWA, that do U visas, some that do SIJS. So we have them, a lot of them are in Lincoln or in Omaha. Some of them, there are some offices in Lexington and other parts, Schuyler, other parts of the state. But what the providers have told me is that generally, they're not restricted by location. They can represent people, whether the people live in Scottsbluff or live in Lincoln, but the issue is really going to be one of transportation. Can people bring the clients to these providers? Because since the applications are generally adjudicated either in Omaha or at the Vermont Service Center, there aren't real difficulties on the immigration side in doing these applications with an agency that is in Omaha if you're out here. It's really a logistical thing about how do we get the client to the agency. And again, you can call people for information. This Center for Legal Immigration Assistance, they have a fair amount of expertise in U visas. I think they told me that something like, we filed 70 U visa cases within the past X amount of time. So these are not just places where they maybe have, some of them have done 1 or 2 cases but may have more expertise. There's University of Nebraska has the College of Law has an immigration clinic that handles some immigration cases. And then Lutheran Family Services also has immigration services around the state, including I think there are 3 different offices. They have 1 office in Lexington as well, and they provide a whole range of immigration assistance. And then we have one resource in Grand Island that I was able to find, and a volunteer lawyers project that represents people in removal proceedings as long as they don't have criminal issues, and that's for free. And then a couple of other legal services providers. And then Appleseed on their website has really great resources and programs on immigration, on listing immigrant legal services providers, but also a lot of sort of community education materials, and it's really worth checking out. And then I've just put some, for those of you who like to read about Nebraska and immigration, there's actually quite a bit of useful and interesting and kind of up-to-date materials on immigration issues in Nebraska. And some of them contain statistics, a lot of them contain profiles of different communities that have dealt with increasing numbers of immigrants. There's a really interesting book that maybe some of you have read about refugee resettlement in Lincoln. I'm reading it now, it's a really big book, and it's more, not necessarily statistics, but it's really more stories and profiles of refugees who have resettled in Nebraska and the kind of things that they face, and the author is really great, so that's something you may want to check out. And then again, this is the part of the presentation that's about different immigration services we talked about. At the very end, which is in itself a presentation that you could have covering a full day, are beyond the immigration benefit issues, but other issues that come up with working with immigrant families. And there's certainly things and issues that are really worth being educated about and aware of. And we've touched on a fair number of them today, but just the idea that whether you're helping a family to apply for immigration benefits or not, there may be really complex ways that mixed status families or undocumented families' immigration situation plays into the dynamics in juvenile court. And they may come from things such as mistrust of authorities, bad experiences with law enforcement in home countries, to things like language barriers or cultural misunderstandings that can create hurdles that often caseworkers are the ones kind of on the front lines dealing with those. There's a really great book that is about a refugee family and their intersection with the child welfare system in Merced, California, called The Spirit Catches You and Then You Fall Down, which is sort of a Hmong saying for epilepsy. And it's a whole story about a child with epilepsy in the juvenile court system and the ways that it was difficult for the system and the family to work together. So that's a really useful book. Again, we've already talked about this. Whole families may qualify for immigration relief, and that depending on the posture of the case and what you have going on, it may be worth assessing all of those options. For children, I think this came up in a big raid that happened in Grand Island several years ago. You may have big workplace raids where adults are taken into custody and children are left without any adult to care for them. So certainly in families where, and particularly for those of you who represent parents, a family having a sort of plan in the event that a parent is detained by the Immigration Service can be a very important thing. And it may be a situation where one or both parents are detained, but there are material that's available online that addresses that situation. Again, the issue of parents who are deported, the federal deportation doesn't work an automatic termination on parental rights. The state procedures have to be followed for that, but the deportation itself is not affecting any of those changes. And it may also be the case that in some situations you may be able to get consulate involved if you need assessments on the sort of propriety of placement of kids outside the United States. There are just some issues that you may help to be aware of for parents with kids in the juvenile court system, including the fact that convictions of crimes for domestic violence, including crimes of child abuse, may be a basis for deportability. So again, this might possibly explain some reticence of families to get involved with the juvenile court system or to call law enforcement because of the potential immigration consequences. And then again, domestic violence and child mistreatment for adults may trigger additional grounds of inadmissibility. Then again, again, as I said, this is not meant to be comprehensive on this issue, but it's just to be aware that even though we've covered an entire day of immigration topics, there's still definitely more that to be learned and to be thought about in these areas. So thank you, everyone, for your 8 hours. As I mentioned before, I'm always happy to be a resource. You can always call me or email me if you remind me where we met or what training you went to would be helpful. But myself and then the people who are listed on the resource list are happy to talk to you. So thank you for your participation and asking questions and answering my questions. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day.